Let's talk about the Riyadh Comedy Festival controversy a bit. I wanted to wait a few weeks before releasing this video because I wanted to be able to see if there's actually going to be like a measurable blowback against any of the comics who participated. I know it's like a week or two out of the kind of mainline discourse right now, but I thought it was important to kind of wait and see how things panned out. And we will go into those numbers at the end, but I think there's actually a more interesting conversation I ran into while making this video. And it's the fact that I've kind of had these uncharacteristic for me, I mean, flip-flops in regard to my position on this. Like starting out, I had kind of what I think you could characterize as the kind of default position online, that it's like immoral and unscrupulous for these comics to be performing for the Saudi government, the Saudi royal family. You know, the logic goes along the lines of, since the Saudi government is brutal and repressive, you know, you're a sellout to perform for them. You're effectively operating as like a propagandist who's going to launder, whitewash their image. But then there's like a second layer to the transgression, which is this idea that like you're undermining the very role, you know, the purported purpose of a comedian, like this idea of speaking truth to power. And then there's yet another layer to this, which is like a lot of comedians have oriented their identity around, you know, declaring themselves a symbol for free speech, or like, these martyrs or leaders against fighting against censorship. Whether or not we see that as legitimate is a different bag of worms. But I would just say, as far as the logical beats of that reasoning, right? I think it's coherent, right? Like I think that logic that, okay, you're effectively operating as like a tool for a brutal regime. Yeah, that makes enough sense. Like I said, I think this would be fair to characterize as the default position, and it's the position I started with. However, let me walk you through, as I thought about it more critically, what flipped me on this. And I'm not going to tell you how many times I flip-flopped back and forth, so it'll be a surprise kind of where I ended up. Let's go into the first reason. So my first problem with this logic that it's, immoral to work for an entity that is like directly or indirectly affiliated with like, we'll say grotesque acts of state-sanctioned violence and human rights abuses, say killing civilians, killing journalists, forced labor, etc. The problem with applying this moral lens in these kinds of situations is no one really applies these rules consistently, right? In fact, it's being applied selectively and based entirely just on feelings and vibes that are unfortunately deeply warped by propaganda, because it's just a reality of the 21st century that, a lot of money is invested by state power centers to make sure that you feel a certain way about violence when it's being committed by the state. So there is an intrinsic softening effect in the way that you have internalized acts of state violence. Whereas by contrast, when you observe violence from an outside actor like Saudi Arabia, you don't have that softening effect, because Saudi Arabia doesn't really invest a lot of money into propagandizing you. So you, for the most part, seek things for what they are with clear eyes. You have a more raw intake of your impressions of their uses of violence, right? Okay, so like I said, if you really believe these, abuses of state power and violence are disqualifying, you're making an extremely arbitrary cutout for the U.S. government and proxies of the U.S. government, who objectively, and this is just the numbers speaking, objectively put up way bigger stats, more bad guy stats, that we are, rightfully condemning the Saudi government for. Right. So the average commenter online in regard to the comics at Riyadh will say, oh, you shouldn't be working for the Saudis. Okay, so the subtext, the implication being, no, you should be working for people in Hollywood, right? Like that's the moral stand, is to work for people in Hollywood. You can make a pretty strong case that Hollywood, in terms of like absolute numbers, is actually responsible for a greater number of human rights abuses and death and suffering than the Saudis are. Right. And in the same line of thinking, do you have these same sorts of condemnation and reactions that you shouldn't work for an employer when the employer is, say, the federal government of the United States or the military, or even just a company owned by BlackRock? Probably not, right? And listen, I know that kind of framing these things can sound very radical, right? All I ask is that if you have an argument or a strong feeling against anything that I'm saying, all I ask is that your counter argument needs to include actual numbers, right? I don't want anything based on feelings. We're going to be basing things on numbers in this conversation, right? All the numbers I'm going to be using are very mainstream, kind of uncontested, first page of Wikipedia level basic numbers. I'm not digging into the archives of like RedTube or whatever to get this information. And finally, before I kind of get into the stats, I need to make it clear, none of what I'm saying is whataboutism, right? Because whataboutism would imply that I'm trying to distract from the wrongdoings of one party by redirecting energy and condemnation to a different one. I'm saying everybody should be condemned for anything wrong that they do. I think it is right to condemn Saudi Arabia, but that shouldn't be to the exclusion of condemning the United States, or at least being morally consistent in how we apply a judgment and moral condemnation, right? The point is to start thinking in a way that is morally consistent and defensible, and to be kind of self-analytical to see kind of where our blind spots are. You shouldn't be applying moral logic in like an ad hoc, feelings-based manner, right? My main purpose in this is, I guess, trying to stimulate maybe some introspection in viewers that I know that I really needed, and maybe would be healthy for people who see this video to also kind of participate in. Okay, so let's hold up some numbers against, the main Saudi Arabia condemnations. Let's start with the simple one. Saudi Arabia has forced labor. Okay, so there's around 740,000 laborers in Saudi Arabia that would fit kind of the international definition of state-imposed or state-coerced labor. But you know who else fits that definition as well? America. In fact, America has over 800,000 incarcerated laborers, and extensive reporting has been done on this. If you interview prison laborers in the U.S., more than 3/4 of them report that it is absolutely not optional. In fact, that there are major consequences if you refuse to work. Solitary confinement, loss of visitation, loss of privileges. The coercion employed in the U.S. for prison labor also meets the international definition for state-imposed forced labor. In fact, the U.S. prison labor system is incredibly profitable. It produces over $11 billion in goods and services in terms of value per year. And it typically pays between pennies per hour, or in 7 states, $0 per hour. So as for forced labor, I'd say that's kind of a moot point. Okay, so the other thing people bring up is Saudi Arabia kills a lot of civilians, right? Let's start with like executing criminals, right? Saudi Arabia executed 196 people in 2022. Yeah, I certainly don't like that. I'm against the death penalty. But again, America also has the death penalty. In fact, like we're at an all-time low in 2025 in terms of people supporting it, and it's still a majority of the country, right? So like back in the 90s, like over 80% of Americans were in favor of the death penalty. And we're at an all-time low in 2025, but it's still 55% of the country. It's still a majority. In fact, like 30% of the country thinks we don't employ the death penalty anywhere close to aggressively enough, or just we don't use it enough. And then if you include, say, the formal executions, that's a few dozen per year in America. But then if you include people killed by police, it's well over 1,000 each year, right? So, I mean, if you want to compare the total amount of domestic killing by the state, America versus Saudi Arabia, it's really not even close if we just look at the numbers. And furthermore, the idea that Americans in general have a huge problem with the idea of executing citizens is really kind of insincere pearl clutching if you just look at the favorability numbers toward the death penalty. Okay, so now let's move on from domestic violence. Let's look at violence done outside of the borders of these two countries, okay? Vietnam War, U.S. killed about 2 million civilians. That's not combatants, just civilians. It was 2 million. Is Vietnam too far back? Okay, fine. Vietnam is expunged. It does not count. Statute of limitations. We'll just keep it in the last 20 years, okay? If we just look at like post 9/11 wars that the U.S. has carried out, over 432,000 civilians were killed. That's just like direct weapon engagement. That is not including any secondary forms of death, like infrastructure collapse, destroying hospitals and people dying from infections and things like that. If you actually include the secondary forms of death, it's between like 4.5 and 4.7 million civilians killed just in the last 20 years from America's Middle East wars. As for like Saudi Arabia, the Yemen war, yeah, if you include secondary deaths, it's like 377,000 civilians, which is a huge number. It's nothing to sneeze at. But again, I mean, if we're holding these numbers up next to each other, America's is an order of magnitude higher. If Saudi's numbers are bad, America's are many times worse. Okay, let's move on to probably the most common thing people bring up with Saudi Arabia, killing journalists. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of killing Jamal Khashoggi. Current numbers, it's about maybe 30 or so are actively imprisoned, like to this day. And as far as documented cases of state eliminating or killing journalists, there's really only 2 cases that I can find information on. Just in the last couple years, the U.S. and Israel and Gaza have targeted and killed over 300 journalists. In terms of the frequency of journalists being killed, no recorded war has ever had anywhere close to these numbers, right? In just the span of 2 years, right? Russia has never killed this many journalists. The Nazis never killed this many journalists. Saudi Arabia never killed anywhere near this many journalists. In the Yemen operations, nothing even comes close to this. Oh, but there were bone saws involved with Khashoggi. Like, that's grotesque and brutal. I mean, okay. I mean, you know what else like removes people's arms and legs? Targeted drone strikes. It's not a separate category of violence because bone saws are involved versus like precision weaponry. That's like totally absurd. And you want to know what Saudi Arabia hasn't done? They haven't supported and funded a genocide that has been internationally and formally recognized. Of course, we're talking about Israel being supported by the United States. The UN has formally concluded that Israel is engaging in acts of genocide. And if you just want to look at where the numbers are in terms of violence so far, Brown University recently released a report concluding that Israel has either killed or gravely injured with life-altering injuries over 10% of the entire population just as of October, right? I mean, imagine lining up everybody you know, and then every 10th person is either just killed or permanently maimed by some horrific injury, right? A Lancet peer-reviewed study is estimating deaths between like 77,000 and 109,000, but that's actually like kind of a few months out of date at this point. So it's well north of 100,000 people killed in Gaza so far. Okay, so let's review the numbers so far. And again, I don't like any of this violence, but we have Saudis on record killing 2 journalists, unacceptable, not cool. Imprisoning 30, not good. Let's say about 1,600 or so executions in the domestically over like the course of 10 years. And we'll say approximately 377,000 civilians killed in the Yemen war. Again, that's including like secondary forms of death like disease and infrastructure collapse. And then, here are the American numbers, right? I don't condone any of this shit, but I mean, somebody needs to help me understand the logic being employed here, right? Why somebody working for U.S. power structures, working for the State Department, is totally not an issue for you, but doing a comedy festival for an entity that is objectively less violent in absolute terms is an enormous problem. Just lay it out like a math problem. Let me see how you're doing your math, just so that I can understand. Okay, so that was my first main set of points that made me flip positions. The idea that when you start actually looking at the numbers, assuming you're American, the criticisms don't really make any sense if you just compare apples to apples in terms of actual stats. My second point that kind of led me to flipping positions on this is a bit more structural and abstract. It basically boils down to the idea that the reality of living in an international capitalist system in which you are like compelled to work, it's kind of a pretense, like built in foundationally, that you're going to have to work for some unsavory, violent entities, right? That this idea that the moral burden is on workers to not work for entities that like contribute directly or directly employ violence isn't really realistic or fair to workers in such a system, right? I mean, you would basically be reducing the legitimate employer pool down to like small mom and pop businesses, which in most developed countries is like a minority of employment, available employment, right? So let's look at it this way. In a developed country, who provides the employment, right? The people with capital. Who provides the most employment? People with the most capital, right? Entities with the most capital. There's a bit of a selection mechanism at play here. Like the entities that have aggregated the most capital, have the most dominant, high leverage positions. How do you think they got there, right? How do they maintain these positions? They're very sought out by a lot of other entities and people that would like to have them. Do you think the selection mechanism that is bringing these people to these positions of power and letting them maintain it is selecting for like the most peaceful, egalitarian, non-violent entities and individuals? Of course not, right? There's no logical reason why such types of people would ever make it to the top of any hierarchy structure, right? So now let's look like specifically at companies, say, in the US. If you work for, say, McDonald's, Starbucks, Amazon, all these corporate chains that are part of these big corporate conglomerates, they are owned by investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, which are the same investment firms that hold like the biggest stakes in defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, et cetera, right? Like for all intents and purposes, like these big investment firms, they are the military industrial complex. Like this isn't some abstract third or fourth order relationship. Like they effectively are the MIC. It's the same money stream, the same money loop. So when you work for McDonald's, right, the value, the revenue that you're creating, that you're producing for McDonald's is quite literally the same revenue, money earnings that are being used to lobby for more foreign wars so that weapon manufacturers can employ and sell more weapons, right? This isn't exactly like a complicated flowchart here. It's pretty in your face. You work in tech, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, like these are the biggest contract holders with the Pentagon, with the Israeli military. You work for a university, the biggest universities in the US all have endowments managed by the same firms that are among the biggest investors in like arms development, right? I mean, it's all the same. It's all the same groups. I mean, we can go on and on like this with this logic. If you work for the US government or a major corporate conglomerate, you are working for an entity that objectively profits from, instigates, facilitates more violence in absolute numbers than the Saudi royal family does. In neither case, it's okay, but I'm just saying we need to look at these numbers with clear eyes and be consistent with the way that we think about these things. So do you see my point with all of this? The point is, it's kind of an unreasonable standard to start holding workers morally responsible for the actions of their employers. Once you start kind of pulling on that thread, you start realizing that like the implication would be that just most workers aren't allowed to work, right? Once you start applying that logic consistently, it's like completely unfeasible. And like your real criticism is really more with the compulsion to work for these bad entities under capitalism, more than it should be you condemning employers for who they end up having, employees for who they end up having to work for, right? Okay, so let's bring it back to the comics again. So in this case, the subtext of the statement, you shouldn't be working for the Saudis. Okay, so the subtext is you should be working for Hollywood. Instead, that's the moral stand, right? Oh yeah, that's such a moral upgrade to be working for Hollywood instead of the Saudis, right? I mean, Hollywood, really acts effectively as an extension of the DoD, of the State Department. It's basically a marketing team. Hollywood itself is like one of the central engines for funding, legitimizing the Israeli military and their conquests in the Middle East. I mean, literally one of their biggest fundraisers. Like when you transact with Hollywood, when you buy a movie ticket, you are literally sending dollars that are going to be used to blow up civilians in Palestine, right? When Bill Burr has a Netflix special in Hollywood, he's literally working for an entity that, objectively speaking, if you look at absolute numbers, is responsible for a larger amount of civilian murder than the Saudis are. So, I mean, this concludes kind of my main second point. Again, that being that this idea that it is incumbent on the worker to screen out like employment from any employers that like are connected to violence or barbarism of some sort. It's just, once you start pulling on this thread, that is just not a realistic expectation to have of a worker in this kind of international capitalist system. Okay, so to reiterate, what I've been leading you through so far is just the mental journey that I went through trying to think about the Riyadh Comedy Festival more critically. We've established that the supposed downsides of doing the comedy festival are really kind of moot points, right? Because if you actually look at the hard numbers, most of the criticisms of Saudi Arabia, that the U.S., in terms of hard numbers and stats, is objectively worse. And then second, we've established that the notion of holding workers responsible in an international capitalist system for finding employment only with morally upstanding entities is really just kind of a completely unreasonable, ridiculous expectation if you don't expect people to starve, right? Which means we're really effectively at net zero. There's no downsides that can be articulated, which means if we even find one upside, then it's a net positive, right? And the comedians should perform in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so what would the upsides be? I think there's actually at least two pretty good points that I've heard made, and they're points that most of the comedians have made trying to defend themselves for why they took the contract. I mean, whether or not that's in good faith is another question, but I think the arguments do hold water, right? So I would say the first upside, the first argument I kept hearing was something along the lines of like the human connection argument. And it's this idea that like, hey, most countries have deeply problematic power structures, right? And there's normal human beings, normal citizens just living underneath those power structures. They're trying to live their lives. They deserve dignity, access to art and culture, et cetera. Like the Saudi citizens, for example, they really don't have that much control over their government. They don't have the power to like effectively rein it in any meaningful way, right? They are required to live under this system. And it's kind of a weird notion that you should be like punishing these people who are really victims of the system that they live underneath by saying, okay, we're also going to deny you like, participating in this art form, stand-up comedy. It feels like you're kind of punishing the citizens. Upside number two, I'm going to call this like the cultural opening argument, which I think is even stronger, right? So the reasoning goes like, well, Saudi Arabia's political culture, their government is repressive. So that should mean that bringing in a kind of naturally subversive, transgressive, critical art form like stand-up comedy is actually kind of a healthy thing for them to be getting more exposed to, right? Like the essence of stand-up comedy is about speaking truth to power, embracing principles of free speech and boundary pushing and tolerance. So if anybody kind of needs more exposure to that, it's not only, normal citizens and civilians living in Saudi Arabia, but just, the power structures writ large. It would be beneficial for them to become more accepting and tolerant of this art form and having it be more normalized in their society. I think that's a strong argument, right? Well, here's the real kicker, the big twist, the big reveal. So I did another 180 on this. So spoiler alert, where I ended up is right back where I started at the beginning, even after all of the reasoning that I've given you so far for why you actually should support the idea of these comics performing in Saudi Arabia, I ended up right back at square one, right back at kind of the mainstream opinion. Do you want to know why? There was one kind of X factor that then got revealed to me at the last second that, and maybe this isn't logically coherent, but for me, it nullified all of this reasoning that I had done up until this point. Do you know what it was? The contract. It was when the agreement was leaked, like actual verbatim parts of the contract that the comics had to sign was leaked to the press. It completely undid all of this argumentation that I had done internally that got me up to this point. So let's take a little look at this contract, shall we? To read it verbatim. Content restrictions. Artists shall not prepare or perform any material that may be considered to degrade, defame, or bring into public disrepute, contempt, scandal, embarrassment, or ridicule, A, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, including its leadership, public figures, culture, or people, B, the Saudi royal family, legal system, or government, and any religion, Islam, religious tradition, religious figure, Muhammad, or religious practice, right? Like, are you fucking kidding me? Like let's put this into perspective of how pathetic this is. Like the purpose of this operation is it's a propaganda whitewashing campaign to begin with. Like it's already theater. It's already fake. Like the point of propaganda, in this case, propaganda aimed at like Westerners, is to persuade them like, hey, this isn't your mom and dad's Saudi Arabia that they grew up with. Like, we're just like you guys now. We have freedom of speech. We're permissive. Look, we have stand-up comedy, freedom of expression. We're just like you guys now, right? And like they can't even commit to their own bit for like 5 minutes. Like it's already fake, but they can't even fake selling that image just for the purpose of their own propaganda, right? Like that's what like insecure fucking losers these people are. You know, they could have made like a brief exception, you know, for jokes that wouldn't normally be permissible for Westerners when they come over, and they wouldn't have to actually change any of their behavior internally. They could still keep jailing people for the same stuff they always did as soon as the cameras left. But it's like, no, they couldn't even risk just playing along for 5 minutes to sell their own propaganda objectives. Like how fucking pathetic that is. And furthermore, like what do you even talk about as a comic when politics, culture, government, and religion are off limits? Like I don't even, what other categories are left at that point? Like fucking shawarma jokes? I'm dying to get footage of like what actually happened over the course of these comedy specials at this Riyadh festival. I'm just dying to know what they even filled the airtime with. It's truly baffling to me. So yeah, like this majorly put me over the edge with kind of my assessment of this festival, because I think it does actually change the nature of the work, right? Like if you think of these comedians, like they are a worker, right? There is something very different from saying like, hey worker, hey artist, hey craftsman, like, can you come do your thing over here? You normally do it over there. We're fans of you over here. Can you do it over here? Right? That's one thing. And before the contract came out, that was kind of the impression of what was happening. Yes? But this is different. This contract is really saying, hey, artist who has credibility and has a following, we want you to come over here wearing your Dave Chappelle skin suit, but you're not actually doing your normal craft, your stand-up comedy. We're actually giving you a work order for a special piece of propaganda that's going to, you know, you're going to cash out your own credibility to make it for us. And here's some blood money in exchange. Like, does that sound good for you? I think this is like a moral distinction in contrast to the point I made earlier about like how, well, you know, it's not really fair to expect workers to avoid employment from like nefarious entities or institutions, right? It's very different when like you're not actually using your trade or your craft. You're actually like making something to order for the purpose of furthering like an authoritarian regime. You're participating in deception. Like you're giving the illusion that, you know, hey, I'm just Dave Chappelle and I'm doing the Dave Chappelle stuff over here. That's not at all what's happening. It's Dave Chappelle making a custom made to order propaganda marketing reel by the Saudi government. I think that's a completely different equation morally. And then to add insult to injury, like these comedians in signing this contract, they reveal that they've been manipulating you, their fan base, this entire time. Like the central underpinning for most of these comics, they market themselves as speaking truth to power, fighting against censorship, fighting for free speech, not just for themselves, but for you. They aren't subtle about this. They repeat it over and over. It's part of the marketing material. This is like in your face, the way they present themselves. It's this idea that like stand-up comedy is not just entertainment. There's this higher calling. You are like this essential, crucial societal role, speaking truth to power. We're not just mercenaries, performing for the highest bidder. We are truth seekers. We hold power structures to account. It is about freedom and principles first and foremost. Like there is an extra dimension to our comedy and where it's coming from that actually gives it more meaning. But then they just brazenly in your face just reveal, oh yeah, that was just marketing material the entire time. We don't really care about government overreach or cancel culture, free speech, any of that shit, right? We saw it as a line that people responded to emotionally, and we used it to help build up a fan base. But it was employed cynically. It was inauthentic. Literally the nanosecond we had a financial opportunity to take a different line, in this case, making custom made to order propaganda sets for the Saudi government, we took it immediately, right? We were never against cancel culture. We just stumbled into a product niche, a marketing niche, and it worked really well. It's no deeper than that. And, I'm not the kind of person that says like things are offensive very often. It's just not part of my lexicon. But this is, as a fan of a lot of these people, this is deeply offensive to me because it's just how brazenly they are just kind of admitting that they were emotionally manipulating us and then kind of like rubbing our noses into it. Like they're not even being shameful about it or like trying to hide it. It's just like, get fucked, sucker. I knew what I was doing all along. I already got your money. I already got your ass in the seats. Now I'm ready to get money from a different buyer, right? And I will adapt to whatever I need to make money in this market, right? They don't even try to hide it. They sold their product on a false pretense, and it's like, you were the sucker that was dumb enough to buy it, right? Is what they're saying. It was all just like cynical engagement farming. It was cynical marketing ploys. There was no broader point being made or broader beliefs underpinning, their craft or what they were making. All right, now to wrap this up, like I promised, we're going to quickly look at if there was any actual material blowback against any of the comics who participated. The short answer is yes, but the longer answer is yes, but it's really only happening to one comic in any notable way, and that's Bill Burr, which I think is kind of funny. I think it would be fair to characterize the audiences of most of the other comics as being more right-leaning, or maybe more apt to say, I think Bill Burr has the highest percentage of his audience being like left-leaning. Maybe that would be a more accurate way to say it. So it kind of makes sense that audience would be more predisposed to blowback and kind of being offended by the implications of undermining your platform and messaging that you've been using to build an audience with by accepting the Saudi money and the Saudi contract. So yeah, let's look at some of the numbers. So Bill Burr, just in 3 weeks after running the festival, insta lost more than 20,000 subscribers, just straight off the top. Podcast views crashed by, at this point, around 75%. I mean, that is just fucking wild. Normal Thursday episode would be about 44,000 views. Now we're at around like 12,000, 10,000 views. A Monday episode would typically be about 81,000. We're down to about 24,000. I mean, there is a tangible blowback that he's experiencing. And one of the responses he gave is he called critics that are holding him to account for not being consistent with the pretense he built an audience with, He called them phony fucking cunts, sanctimonious cunts. Those are his words. I think that's a really funny use of the word sanctimonious, right? Because I would say it was sanctimonious positioning yourself as being a truth teller, as like, having these certain moral standards that gave you kind of the position to critique power structures the way you've been. I mean, that has been like the center of your comedic material for like 10 years now. It is critiquing power structures and positioning yourself as somebody with standards who's willing to, speak truth to power based on like principles that you have. Nobody's forcing you to do that. Like, you're the one taking that line, right? And if anything is fucking sanctimonious, it's taking that line, it's selling yourself on that pretense when you don't fucking mean it. I mean, who is the sanctimonious cunt in this situation? The people that call you out for being full of shit and emotionally manipulating them and selling them really what's like a false product and then just pointing that out, or the person who's fucking lying and pretending to be something they're not, just for the sake of filling seats. You be the judge of that. Okay, so that's my video. Like I said, it was a big mental journey working through all of this. I don't typically go back and forth 2 to 3 times when I think about these kinds of current events. But yeah, talk about taking the long way around, the scenic route, to come back to just the exact same conclusion you started out with. Though to be clear, I do think like my original line of logic still holds about, the nature of the capital worker relationship kind of intrinsically necessitating that you work for kind of unsavory, violent entities. And also this idea that like, if you actually are even-handed in applying, moral frameworks, anything you criticize Saudi Arabia for, if you were being consistent, you would be accusing America for even more vociferously. But I think that the variable that I kind of stumbled upon that at least changes things for me is the question is like, are you, a worker, a craftsman, an artist, whatever, and you're just doing your craft in a different place for a different set of people, right? Which is what kind of, I think the implication would be if this contract didn't exist, right? It's just like, okay, no, they're just doing their thing somewhere else for a different audience. Or conversely, in this case, like with the contract, are you actually just using your skills, your reputation, your credibility to actually generate something completely different? It's not even like really your craft. It's like this nefarious, cynical manipulation operation, right? Like people like Chappelle, they're using the goodwill, the good image that they've built up in America doing stand-up, right, to facilitate a propaganda campaign that doesn't even actually feature stand-up. Like we said, like by any objective definition of stand-up, whatever that content is that they're creating under those conditions is not stand-up comedy. I don't know what the fuck it is or what they're talking about. I don't think anybody would call that stand-up comedy. So, somebody like Chappelle, you're putting on like a skin suit of a beloved known stand-up comedian, pretending to be that person, who built up their fan base apparently on completely false pretenses, pretending to be a comic for the purpose of like cynically manipulating fans around the world, tricking them into thinking that you're doing stand-up comedy in Saudi Arabia when it's something else entirely. But yeah, I mean, that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching and making it all the way through. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and consider checking out my Substack if you want to go more in depth on any of these topics. Take care.